You stand so close to the gate that you can hear the iron straps cooling in the night air, ticking and settling like the breath of a sleeping animal that knows it is being watched. And in your hands the petard neither growls nor purrs, but sits heavy and patient, a small iron bell of consequence pressed against fresh timber, a promise shaped like a drum that will wake the world when asked. While above your head the parapet mutters with men who do not see you but sense you, unseen and unslept voices trading curses and prayers, and you taste the woolly tang of slow match smoke on your tongue, as if fear itself had a flavor deep and old, while your fingers close in a quiet ritual over cord and nail. And your mind, miraculously still, lays out the steps as carefully as you laid out the plan with your captain at dusk, because your task is simple and terrible, to fix a charge to a stubborn hinge the way one might hang a bell in a chapel, to tell the gate something it has never wanted to hear, and to do it as if you had all the time in the world, while musket balls lick splinters from your mantlet, while a lantern winks once from the sap behind you, while breath settles into the kind of slowness that can carry a man through either madness or mastery. And as the cord burns down and the night narrows to the pulse in your throat, you realize that the only distance that matters now is the space between courage and caution, a space measured in heartbeats and sparks, a space you alone must cross. Before you learned to walk toward gates with iron cradles under your arm and destiny tucked into your breast, you were a soldier like the rest, trading steps for coin and coin for bread, while your senses trained themselves to the scents and sounds of camp, pitch smoke and boiled meat, oiled locks and oaths in a dozen tongues. Yet somewhere along the way you fell into the company of engineers and found that their arithmetic, their ropes and rods and their solemn way of measuring the world, suited the way your mind stays open under pressure. So when they asked for bold hands and steady nerves, you stepped forward, because the promise was plain: extra pay for extra hazard, a narrow brotherhood with its own customs and a laugh that rarely reaches the eyes, and because there is something in you that craves the clean logic of a single moment, when all the lines converge, and the outcome, one way or another, is irrevocably decided. You rise before dawn and sleep after midnight, even when no charge is planned, for a siege moves like a tide, and your work rides its edges, and your meals come lukewarm when they come at all, and your letters, if you write any, turn sparse and practical, not because you lack feeling, but because words grow heavy when they sit too close to powder and oak. And in the tent of the engineers, where the light is always bad and the maps always smudged, you learn to listen as if every word were a nail, every silence a plank, and every doubt a knot you must work with careful fingers rather than a blade. For knives make haste, and haste makes smoke, and smoke is the one thing you cannot afford to breathe when you are counting seconds in the dark. You wear what they give you and what you salvage, a buff coat stained with years of weather, a breastplate that has caught more splinters than bullets, a morion or a pot that tightens your skull like a thought that will not let go, stout gauntlets rubbed with tallow, because everything in your world wants to catch fire. Speed of the O, speed of the O. And your belt carries the habits of your trade, a linstock with its sullen glow, like a fire that refuses to die, a length of match that smells like a wet stable and burns like a patient fuse, a knife for rope and wood, not for men, and a small pouch of priming that will not be described even in whispers, because you learned early that recipes travel like diseases, and the cure is always the same silence that stands between the words we use and the deeds we commit. Your comrades call you by your trade, Petardier, with that blend of respect and mischief reserved for those whose jobs make even gamblers look cautious, and though they pretend to joke about your short future, they also give way when you pass, and they drink from your cup as if luck were contagious. And sometimes, after a successful blast, men you barely know will clap you on the shoulder with a gentleness that borders on reverence, not because they mistake destruction for heroism, but because they watched you walk into a moment they would not, and return from it carrying the bewildered quiet of someone who stepped into the throat of thunder and came out with his ears ringing and his hands still whole. If you let yourself think about reputation, you will falter. If you let yourself think about death, you will be clumsy. If you let yourself think about glory, you will be careless. So you train yourself to think instead about distances and angles, about weather and wood grain, about the voices of boards under pressure, and the way old hinges sag at the first true knock. You think about the way a gate leans into its own age, and how a wall keeps secrets in the damp. And you remember every scrap of craft your masters taught you, how to read stone like a saint reads relics, how to listen for hollows with your knuckles and bones, how to harness the obedience of materials without falling in love with your own cleverness. For pride is a fuse that lights itself and burns faster than anything you carry. You did not set out to be brave, and you are not brave now. You have simply found a way to behave with consistency in the presence of fear, which is not courage as poets describe it, but a sort of familiar, a creature that sits on your shoulder and whispers advice in a voice so calm it might be mistaken for reason. And so you hold that creature close as you wait for the dusk orders, as you study the sketch of the bastion and the line of the ditch, as you finger the little chips of charcoal that mark your plan like stars, and you decide, not once but a dozen times, to be a man who climbs quietly toward necessity rather than a man who lets necessity climb over him. The day begins in the grey hour when the camp cannot tell whether it is waking or remembering itself, and you walk through rows of tents that smell of damp cloth and low fires, men turning in blankets, horses breathing mist, the sharper scent of the baker's ovens rolling outward like a rumor of kindness. And you feel the familiar weight on your belt as if it were a hand reassuring you that nothing essential has changed, not the slope of the glacis, not the measure of the ditch, not the unyielding temperament of stone, and certainly not the small arithmetic that counts your strides and translates them into seconds, because the mathematics of your trade is a living thing that crawls around the edges of your mind until it finds a warm place to curl up and hum. At the engineer's table you receive the outline, not too much detail, and not too little, a fortification that has chewed men before and will chew them again if allowed, a gate reinforced by iron straps wide as palms and studded like a knight's disdain, flanked by a stubborn slice of wall that bulges like a shoulder raised against a blow, and a ditch that looks harmless in the morning but will turn to a lake of black glass by night. And you listen while the captain draws the routes of skirmishers and the path of the sap, and while he speaks in his dry voice of angles and fields of fire, you run your finger backward over the plan, starting at the gate and tracing your return out of danger, because going in is an article of faith, but coming out is a matter of technique. You walk the forward trenches before the sun lifts fully, because light makes promises that night may not keep, and you stop at intervals to press your palm to the gabions, feeling the damp of the earth they shelter, smelling the old hay that holds their shape. And you greet the men behind the mantlets, their faces creased in dust and humour, the kind of humour that keeps a man quiet when he should be bold, and bold when he should be quiet. And you ask after the temper of the enemy, whether they fired low or high, whether they favoured the left flank when the moon came free of the clouds, whether they sent out parties to test the sap, or merely shouted threats into the dark like children learning to love the sound of their own names. When you return to the tent, the petard is waiting, a squat, sullen instrument that takes no pleasure in being named, and yet acquires one when men are nearby, and you run your eyes over it, not like a lover but like a priest checking a vessel, a curve of iron that belongs to no household and all households, a throat that will swallow what you feed it and return the favour in a way no one forgets. And you look to the plank to which it will be mated, seasoned and cut to fit the face of the gate as a hand fits a face when a farewell needs to be said without words. And you note the ironwork and the pegs and the travelling nails, and your hands move through the checklist without hurry, because impatience and precision have never met except by accident, and their children are never kind. There is a small superstition among your kind, not to lay a hand flat on the iron, not to tap it as if asking for luck, but to hold it gently by the edges, the way one holds a mirror when one cannot bear to see oneself. And though you pretend to scorn such notions, you find yourself obeying them even as you arrange the tackle and test the cordage, not because you fear the spirit of the weapon, but because you fear the spirit of your own carelessness. And you have learned to clothe attention in ritual, since ritual never argues and attention always wins. You eat a little, not to feed strength but to fend off weakness, a heel of bread and a strip of something you chew until it tastes of nothing at all, and you drink just enough water to remind your throat that its work is not done. And while the camp loosens into afternoon, you rest your eyes without sleeping, because sleep before danger is a lie the body tells the mind to make it love itself too much, and you would rather sit with your thoughts and let them grow lank and weary, than lay them down and find them fat and slow when you call them to rise. The sun folds itself behind the outline of the fortress, and the shadow of the walls grows long and deliberate, and the captain's voice descends on you like a bell, not loud but organizing the air, and he speaks with the courtesy he reserves for men who may not return. He names the hour and the signal and the men who will cover your approach, the pair of musketeers with their lanterns hooded and their nerves drawn taut as bowstrings, the pikemen who will stand where men do not want to stand, the carpenters who will wait with tools they hope not to use, and finally the runners who will carry the word of your success or failure to the ears that must decide whether to risk more lives on the promise of a hole. You go early to the forward sap, and you sit with your back to the earth while the sky works its charcoal into blue, and you handle the linstock as if it were a walking stick, and the slowness of the match as if it were a prayer. And you say nothing, because nothing needs to be said, and words travel farther at night, climbing ladders made of quiet, while the fort gathers itself, sending out a few probing shots like coughs, measuring the boundaries of its vigilance the way a man checks the walls of his house after a storm, to see what rocks have shifted, and what cracks have widened, and you listen to those shots as you would listen to a clock, noting intervals, counting comfort. When the time comes to move, you do not stand quickly, for quickness wastes itself in gestures. You rise as the sap roller creaks forward, a moonlit beast of wicker and earth, and you settle in behind it with your helpers like figs set in a bowl. And your hands find their places without looking, one on the linstock, one on the frame of the petard where it nestles against the plank, and you begin that sideways walk down the sapped approach, left foot first, then right, blessing the men who cut this path by day while others argued about honor and courage, because you have learned that honor is a path in daylight, and courage is a path in darkness, and neither means much without the slow, unyielding labor that gives them shape. Approaching the ditch, you smell water and weeds and the old mud that remembers every man who ever fell into it, and you feel the air cool, as if a vast mouth opened ahead to speak your name, and in that chill your senses steady in the way they always do just before the part of the night that changes men. Your hearing sharpens until the creak of a leather strap sounds like the groan of a ship's hull, and the click of a distant flintlock might be the chirp of an insect possessing lethal opinions, and you glance once at the musketeers who will cover you, their faces flat as coins, their mouths hard with promises, and you nod, because nods are better than words in places where words might catch fire. At the lip of the ditch you take the weight, not a gesture but a commitment, the petard and its cradle coming alive in your hands as the roller can go no farther, and for a moment you are nowhere but inside that weight, not a man carrying a device, but a device carrying a man. And you feel the world narrow to the gate ahead and the earth beneath your boots and the gentle religious arithmetic that counts out your steps, 3 to steady, 2 to glide, 1 to settle into the balance that will carry you forward over mud that will steal your shoes if you treat it like an enemy. And you begin to cross, breath slow, purpose slower, all noise rolled into a silence that feels like the underside of a bell. The wall looms and the gate details itself in the thin light, iron straps dappling into view like the ribs of a mighty fish, the wood grain tight as the skin of a drum drawn for judgment, and the small door within the great door shows the scars of other tries and other nights. And you think, not without sympathy, how many times this gate has been asked to keep men apart, and how many times it has succeeded, and you pause under its shadow, not to pray but to measure the distance from your belly to your fate, the way a mason measures the span between two stones, because the strength of the wall is the honesty of that space, and the life of the Petardier is the honesty of this one. Your assistants move when you move, kneeling not to worship but to work, the plank held close and the hooks fed to their homes with the slow certainty of men collecting eggs in a henhouse. And when your glove lands against the iron you do not slap it or pat it, but press carefully, feeling not for the willing place but for the true place, the spot where the gate will listen but not yield, where persuasion must be introduced with a single sentence that begins with a spark, and ends in a roar. And while you test the fit and the nails consider the wood, the fort wakes briefly above you. A shout, a scrape, the brush of cloth against crenellation, then a shot that goes wide and dies somewhere unremarked, and a second that bites chips from the board above your ear, gifts from a host that does not know your name, yet would dearly like to send it home. The linstock comes forward like a thought you have been saving, the match glowing with its own small logic, refusing to hurry even now, and you bow your head without meaning to, because the habit of bowing is older than war. And you tell your breath to behave, and you find the place, and the place finds you, and you put the fire where it needs to be, as gently as a nurse puts medicine between a child's lips. And for a fraction of a fraction, nothing happens, and then everything happens at once. The world resumes its motion. The assistants pull you backward with a grip that leaves bruises like little maps on your arms. The musketeers flare back a pair of brighter pinions that flatten the nearest heads on the wall. And the three of you begin the most precise walk of your lives, not running, not crawling, keeping pace with a sound that has not yet arrived, a sound that is already inside you. The blast does not feel like noise, not at first. It feels like a hand fitting tightly over your entire body, and then letting go, a compression that finds and corrects every error in your posture, and every lie you ever told your bones about their alignment. And only then does the sound arrive, like a conditional sentence fulfilled, and the air turns into moving glass, and the gate speaks a language it has refused to use for 40 years. And you are thrown not backward but sideways, because the night is kind to those who bend, and you land among splinters and a small rain of objects that belonged to other men's pockets and never expected to be airborne. A button, a nail, a shave of iron, the language of debris. And you taste grit between your teeth and the warm copper of your own mouth, and you decide to be alive. Your first duty after the blast is not to boast or to look back, it is to listen, because the gate is a creature, and creatures die loudly, and you need to know if its death cry means ruin or merely injury. And you hear the pikemen move like the points of a compass finding north, and you hear the engineers cough the way old men do when they are grateful and embarrassed, and you hear the musketeers laugh without humor, and you hear yourself breathing a little more quickly than you would like. And you understand that the moment outside time has concluded. You are back inside the stream where decisions move as swiftly as water after a storm, and you prepare to either signal the advance or signal another try, and in the space between those signals, you discover the true occupation of your soul, which is to remain very calm in places where other men hurry. Tonight, the timbers have done what timbers do when asked firmly. They have cracked and shifted, and one hinge is now no longer a hinge but a memory, and a faltering chain of metal has learned that it is not a chain without its anchor. And so the little door within the big door has lost its dignity, and leans open like a man who has fallen asleep in a pew. And you give the sign. The assault party moves with that mix of discipline and chaos that belongs to people who have waited too long to do something they were not born to love, and as they pass you, you see their eyes, the soberness of them, and you feel neither pride nor guilt, only the simple gravity of a job done to the edge of its purpose. Of the defenders you see little beyond fire and silhouettes, and the thin bright scratch of shot across the dark, but you feel them in the way your back feels a wall, the pressure and the neighborly wrath of men whose homes and pride are bound up in the thickness of stone. And you do not hate them, you do not need to. Hate takes time, and you have none. You merely spare them a good wish that their powder be damp and their arms tired, and you hope quietly that tomorrow, if fortune refuses to finish its shift, they will be permitted to tell stories of courage that give comfort to their mothers and their sons, because war demands a fairness it will never grant, and you have learned to give it yourself where you can. You withdraw to the forward trench, because you are not a duelist but a craftsman whose tools are now put away, and sitting there you watch the assault through the little slits of darkness between mantlets and shoulders. And you realize that the earlier silence has left fingerprints on your mind. Everything is either too loud or too quiet, and you steady yourself by naming things. A broken board, a dropped hat, a ladder with 3 rungs missing, a spray of sparks, a man who should not have stood when he did, and may not stand again. And you find that this recital of simple nouns reorders the world into pieces you can hold, and you are grateful to language for being a thing that exists even when stones are arguing with iron. When the call goes up and the horn blows and the men fall back with more lives than anyone expected, you do not count the saved and lost. That is not your arithmetic. You simply bless the pattern that emerges from the dust, a pattern that suggests another night will be permitted, another plan, another correction to an error that only reveals itself after being made. And you let your shoulders loosen under their plates, and you pour a little water over the match because your day is done and your night is almost through, and you walk back down the sap feeling a part of the earth rather than a trespasser on it, as if the ditch were a road, and the road were a kind of book you have learned to read. Back in the tent, men you barely know will try to fill the air with congratulations the way a cook fills a pot with broth, and you will take some, because refusing would be cruel, but not much, because there is a poverty in you that refuses unearned coin. And you will hang up your coat and your gloves, and you will sit not heavily but with a deliberate gratitude that furniture still serves its purpose, and the captain will nod to you like an old fence post that knows the weather, and you will nod back. And he will say nothing about cunning or valor. He will ask only whether you need another pair of hands, or if the next device should be readied of a different temper, and you will answer simply, because simplicity is the language of men who must work again tomorrow. If someone asks you, as they sometimes do, why you do such work when safer work exists in the same army and safer armies exist in the same world, you will not speak about the additional coins that clink differently in your purse, or the small privileges too small to be worth naming. You will say only that you prefer the truthfulness of things that either work or do not work, that you have tired of arguments that cannot be resolved, and of threats that cannot be carried out, and that walking toward a gate with a device that turns wood into wind is a kind of argument the knight is wise enough to settle, and that even failure, if you survive it, teaches a purity that victory sometimes forgets. There are rules you follow that no one wrote and no court will enforce. Do not hurry a man carrying fear. Do not mock a man carrying hope. Do not work by anger's light, because it will blind you when you need to see. And do not name a success too soon, because success has a jealous sister who walks behind it with a knife. And you keep these rules the way sailors keep salt, within reach and always ready to lend their savor to an hour that would otherwise taste of ash. And when you break one, as you will, you do not ask forgiveness of the gods of war. You ask it of your hands, which deserve better. You write a letter if there is time, and if there is no one to receive it, you write it anyway, because the hand knows how to make peace with the mind when the mind will not be comforted by drink or sleep. And in that letter you do not describe what you did, because what you did belongs to the company, and the company belongs to the nameless dead. You describe instead the color of the evening, a plain brown with a red edge, and the look of the ground when the blast shakes the grass into a single shiver, and the way voices sound when they are glad to be alive but do not want to show it. And you ask whoever reads the letter, even if it is only you some later day, to remember that this is what it felt like to be a man who asked wood to tell the truth. When dawn comes back in its grey shirt and the fort sits smoking like a kitchen that has finished feeding a crowd, you rise without complaint, and you walk out once more to see what the night has brought. And if the gap is good, you will say so, and if it is not, you will say that too, and you will explain not in excuses but in causes, the way a wheel explains ruts and a river explains banks, and the captain will accept your words as he accepts the weather, not happy and not angry, and the men will look at you as men look at a priest who has performed a baptism for a child who still coughs, hopeful and irritated, and ready to go again. Sometimes the petard does not speak loud enough. Sometimes the gate has secrets it shares only with time and frost, and on those nights you must carry back not your device but your disappointment, and it will be heavy, heavier than iron and wood, heavier than fear. And people will ask you to set it down, and you will refuse, because you know that to put it down is to put down the part of you that listens harder the next time, that measures twice where once would do, that remembers the grain runs one way and not the other, and you have learned, perhaps the hardest of your lessons, that failure is an instrument you must tune with your own blood. The phrase haunts you, the one men say with a grin that fades too soon, hoist with his own petard. And you have known men so lifted, good men and clever ones, And you know that accident and error look the same in the instant when iron becomes air, and you keep their names folded in the quieter corners of your memory, not as warnings but as companions, not as ghosts who demand excuses, but as neighbors who remind you to borrow only what you can return. And you honor them the only ways your trade allows, by cleaning your tools and keeping your hands, even when shaking, steady. You are not a philosopher. You are a laborer of moments with a specialty in doors. And yet, as you sit on the edge of the trench watching the sky fold into itself, you think, in the way a tired man thinks, that perhaps the world is made of thresholds, and we are meant to tend them. Some of us at the gates of cities, some at the gates of homes, some at the gates between anger and compassion, and that any fool can kick a threshold down, but it takes a certain tenderness to decide when to knock, when to lift the latch, and when to ask the thunder to lend its heavy hand. On another night, not this one, you will be asked to take your instrument to a bridge instead of a gate, or to a sally port that pretends innocence behind its ivy, or to a powder magazine whose guardians look like children until they raise their muskets and become old in a breath. And you will go, because your loyalty is not to the shape of the thing you face, but to the discipline that stands behind your face. And you will find that bridges listen differently than gates, that stone answers in a deeper register than wood, that arches have pride and straight beams have stubbornness. And you will adjust, not your courage but your approach, because you are not married to methods, you are married to outcomes. There are nights when the rain makes a curtain between you and purpose, and your match sizzles like a snake disturbed in its den, and on those nights, you borrow fire from men who keep it under little tin hats, as if flame were a noble guest that must not be allowed to see the poverty of its host. And you accept this borrowed brightness with the gratitude of a man who knows that all lights are cousins, lanterns and stars, and the single bright eye of a petard grown curious. And you recall in that moment the oldest human lesson, that nothing we do is done alone. Even the loneliest task is a bundle of hands hidden in its handle. If you live long enough in this work, you will come to recognize seasons inside a siege that do not match the calendar. A spring when men think every night will be the one, and sing like boys. A summer when fatigue makes fools of them, and they laugh at things that are not funny. An autumn when the fort looks like a tired animal, and the attackers look like farmers who planted the wrong crop. And a winter when decisions fall like snow, and every footprint must be measured because the ground beneath is a liar. And in each of these seasons your task remains the same, to hold the quiet center, and to speak the language of necessary force with a grammar that offends as little as possible. There is a boy who follows your steps sometimes, a drummer with more courage than sense, who asks about everything because he has not yet learned the cost of questions. And you tell him what you can. You tell him that the petard is not a monster, and neither are the men on the wall. You tell him that fear is a good teacher and a bad landlord. You tell him that the line between pride and folly is drawn in ash and dust, and must be redrawn every day. And one night he will hand you your linstock with both hands and the seriousness of a magistrate, and you will take it from him as if accepting a sentence that has already been appealed and upheld. And you will remember weeks later when he is gone to some other company, or to none at all, how his questions made the night less narrow. The paymaster with his ledgers and his sweated brow will look at you like a balance that never quite settles, and he will count your hazard premium in a way that suggests charity to everyone but you. And you will let him, because arguing over coins with a man who fears your trade would be a cruelty, and because you know that the true currency of your craft is a kind of quiet not found in market stalls, a quiet you can carry into any room and lay on the table like a cloth. And men will eat better with it there and not know why, and women will look at you as if hearing something distant and ancient, and children will mistake you for a storyteller who forgot his stories and came anyway, and in a way they will be right. Once you watched a wall fall not from your work but from the work of time, a section that had been waiting for a kind word to release itself, and the way it went down, with a soft sigh and a burst of dust like the breath of a sleeping giant, taught you that not all force is violence, that some force is simply permission granted at last. And you have carried that lesson like a warm stone in your pocket, touching it when commanders roar and captains furrow their brows, because sometimes the best way to move a thing is to let it decide to move, and sometimes the only way is to ask the thunder, and be ready to step aside. and your craft is knowing the difference in bad light with bad information, and a bad chance of being right. Tonight, though, the thunder already spoke, and you will smell it on your skin long after you wash, and your ears will tell you lies about distance, and sleep will come with images of wood turning to curtains and iron turning to flowers, and you will wake with your hands stiff and your knuckles swollen, and you will flex them until they remember their duties, and you will rise again into the same patient world that looked at you yesterday, and will look at you tomorrow, and the trench will still lead toward the gate, and the gate will still lead toward the heart of men who own nothing but their breath and their boundaries, and you will walk, because walking is what you do, toward a conversation no one wants and everyone understands. When the siege is a story and the map is folded away, and men have found new quarrels to carry like torches into different nights, there will be those who remember only the charges and the breaches, the moments when walls confessed their weakness and gates turned into air. But you will remember the long, long seconds before flame touched faith, the weight of wood and iron against your chest, the way fear sized you like a tailor, and decided you could be trusted with its best coat. And you will remember the voices, friend and foe, light and low, and how they made a music that meant nothing except that you were not alone, not then, not ever, not in the task of making the world decide how it will hold itself together. You will think perhaps that your trade existed before you, and will exist after, changing tools but not terms, and that somewhere a century from now, or a continent away some other set of hands will perform the same slow ballet, under different stars with the same old prayers, and the same old result, the sudden conversion of expectation into consequence. And you will smile at the stubbornness of human invention and the mercy of human routine, the way both save lives and cost them, the way both leave behind a residue of memory that smells of smoke and rain and bread. If someone records your name, they will probably spell it wrong, and if they record your deeds, they will leave out the waiting, the measuring, the listening, as if a miracle did not require 1,000 small obedient acts to convince it to step into the light. And that is well, because you do not require applause, you require only that the next man in line find a path smoother than yours, and that the story of the Petardier, the one who plants thunder where men expect wood to keep its manners, be told sometimes in a voice like this one, a voice that moves slowly, that favors long sentences and patient punctuation, and the dignity of calm, a voice that carries across time and ditch and dust, and says gently to anyone who cares to hear it, you can be afraid and still do the work. So you bundle your match and hang your gloves. You take one last walk along the trench where your footsteps know the ruts and your body knows the angles, and you lay down where the earth is softest, and the sky admits a small constellation to keep you company, and you let your eyes close while the camp breathes, and you allow yourself, for a few heartbeats, to be a man without a task, neither planner nor instrument nor witness, simply a creature with bones and breath, and in that little heaven you promise whatever gods govern thresholds, that you will do your part again when ordered, and that you will try with what steadiness you can borrow from the night, to come back whole. Because in the end this is all any Petardier can claim, that you walked where most would not, that you set your hands to a door that would not open and made your case in the oldest language the world understands, that you listened to the reply and accepted it, and that you returned, if fortune and craft allowed, not to applause or reward but to the simple quiet of tools put away and comrades sleeping, and if that quiet seems thin to those who have never earned it, you forgive them, for it is the richest thing you know, and it is enough. And when the sun rises and the bellies growl and the captains clear their throats, you will get up and go to work. Because for you, and for those like you, the work is the prayer and the prayer is the peace.